Well, it's just gone 4, so are we all set to start? Yes? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Balancing Act, Jobs and Wages in the Middle East and North Africa when Crisis Hit. This is a seminar, and it's been a series of seminars that ERF has held in partnership with the Office of the Chief Economist, MENA department in the World Bank. We'll have an opportunity to discuss the recent report telling us about, I think, extreme is no longer in order of all the unprecedented challenges coming together to give us a forecast of a very challenging situation on the jobs and employment front. So the report is going to tell us about these and poses some very serious questions. The report will be presented by Nelly Malek and Jessica Torres, who are two of the key authors of that report. They both are economists with the Office of the Chief Economist of the MENA department. And then we'll be hearing from two distinguished lead commentators that I'll be presenting at the time, both of whom are actually proudly ERF research fellows, Dr. Raghi Asad and Dr. Irene Silwanis. I think so in the interest of time, we are hoping that Roberta would be able to join in at some point. And sincere apologies, Dr. Ibrahim has been taken ill, so he wouldn't be able to join us this afternoon. So without further ado, I give the floor to, is it Nelly going first? Nelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shireen, and thank you, ERF, for hosting us today. I'm going to share my presentation right now. So today we're going to present the findings of the MENA Economic Update, the October 2023 edition. The title of this report is Balancing Act, Jobs and Wages in the Middle East and North Africa when Crisis Hit. The team is grateful to Roberta Gatti and Daniel Lederman for their guidance. The team also includes Jessica Torres, Joanna Silva, Rana Lotfi, and Ilya Suvanov, and myself, Nelly Malek. Before we start by presenting the key findings of the MENA Economic Update, we would like to highlight that all the macroeconomic forecasts that we are about to present were at the time of the publication of this report on October the 5th. In terms of macroeconomic outlook, economic activity in MENA is forecast to experience a sharp deceleration in 2023. Successive oil production cuts combined with relatively low oil price levels brought an end to the tale of two MENAs and the diverging growth patterns observed between oil exporters and oil importers in the region. In MENA, GDP growth rate is forecast to decline from 6% in 2022 to 1.9% in 2023. And GCC countries were forecast to experience the sharpest deceleration from 7.3% in 2022 to 1% in 2023. As with every edition of the MENA Economic Update, we have a focus section, and this edition focuses on labor market adjustments to various shocks in the region. We estimate that the global shocks that hit the MENA region during the past 3 years, between 2020 and 2022, resulted in an increase of over 5.1 million people becoming unemployed in the region. Our estimates also show that if MENA had the same unemployment response as other emerging market and developing economies, this would have resulted in 2.1 fewer unemployed individuals in the region. In this report, we highlight the Balancing Act, which is the delicate trade-off that economies must face during periods of economic downturns. We highlight that during periods of economic downturns that reduce labor demand, economies face a trade-off between more unemployment and lower real wages. Neither one of these outcomes is desirable because job displacement can lead to labor scarring, which is a term that's often used in the academic literature to highlight long-term negative consequences that are associated with job losses, such as, for example, earning losses, but also higher likelihoods of being unemployed or informally employed in the long term. At the same time, the erosion of real incomes can deepen existing income inequality and burden the poor. The policy recommendations of this report are clear. We highlight that public policies should protect the most vulnerable segments of the population with well-targeted cash transfers while allowing real wages to adjust. Before we move on to the labor market adjustment to various shocks in the region, Jessica is going to present the macroeconomic outlook, and then she's also going to present the framework for the report before we move on to adjustments to various shocks, and then we're going to conclude with some policy implications for the report. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Nelly. So like Nelly pointed out, these macroeconomic forecasts come from the World Bank's macro poverty outlook as of the date of publication of this report, which is October 5th. In 2023, the region was forecast to decelerate sharply from the performance that it exhibited in 2022. In these figures, we are showing an index of cumulative growth in real GDP in MENA. In the left panel, we are comparing MENA to the rest of the world. And in the right panel, we are showing three MENA country groups, the GCC, developing oil exporters in blue, and developing oil importers, excluding Egypt, in green, and Egypt is the black line in the right panel. The surge in oil prices in 2022 brought extraordinary growth to the MENA region. As we can see in the left panel, MENA exhibited a rate of growth of about 6%, which is about 3 percentage points higher than the average for the rest of the world. And this fast pace of growth was driven by the GCC, as we can see in the right panel, in that red line right there, which exhibited rates of growth of about 7% on average. In 2023, growth will be more moderate, and this is again driven by the oil exporters in the region, especially the GCC. As of October 5th, the region was forecast to experience a rate of growth on average of 1.9%. Among the GCC, the average is forecast as at 1%, significantly less than the 7.3% exhibited in 2022. Among developing oil importers, the average is 2.4%, again, significantly less than the 4.3% exhibited in 2022. And among oil importers, the average is 3.6%, less than the 4.9% observed in 2022. Next slide, please. Base effects, we're going to pull growth down in 2023. But the largest downgrades occurred after the oil production cuts announced by members of OPEC+. In this figure, we are showing revisions to the 2023 forecast each month by private sector analysts, and we are showing revisions relative to the forecasts made in February of 2022 before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In the figure, we are marking the months of the OPEC+ announcements, first in October of 2022, then April of 2023, and then the voluntary cut announced by Saudi Arabia in June of 2023, which was extended until the end of the year. And what we want to highlight in this figure is the sharp downgrade in April, and then the second structural break with the announcement in April and then in June, with again the GCC driving these patterns for the MENA region. Among developing oil importers, the spike in inflation among advanced economies and some emerging markets across the world led to a tightening of financial conditions. In MENA, this contributed to currency depreciations among indebted economy, which in turn has contributed to spikes in rate of inflations, and developing oil importers are grappling with the effects from all these shocks. In this figure, what we show are rates of inflation in MENA economies after adjusting for the depreciation of the currency. The bar in red is showing the average headline inflation between October of 2021 and February of 2022, the pre-war average. The blue bar is showing the average in the post-Ukraine war from March of 2022 to August of 2023. And then in green, we are showing a counterfactual rate of inflation, the average if the exchange rate had remained at the levels observed in February of 2022. And we can see first, when we compare the red bar to the blue bar, the spike in inflation, and then we see how significantly lower the rates of inflation would have been without the depreciation of the currency. In Egypt, actually, this counterfactual rate of inflation is negative, but that is because in this back of the envelope calculation, what is left after we remove the depreciation of the currency are the price controls and other subsidies, which in this exercise, we assume that they would have occurred anyways. Next one, thank you. These global shocks from the period of 2020 through 2022 have also brought the highest levels of volatility in MENA terms of trade since 1980. Terms of trade is the ratio of the price of exports to the price of imports. And what we observe here is that volatility in terms of trade in MENA is on average significantly higher, consistently higher compared to the average emerging market and developing economies. And we see that this is again driven by the oil exporters in the region and especially the GCC. Russia's invasion of Ukraine affected the terms of trade of the MENA region through the shocks to the price of oil and the price of agricultural commodities. And we see in the last data point in this figure that actually this volatility, this index is now the highest ever, highest even compared to the mid-1980s and also to the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And so in the fog of all this macroeconomic turmoil, shocks to terms of trade, currency depreciations, inflations, we cannot lose sight of the people of MENA and how these shocks are going to ultimately affect them. And that is what we are trying to do in the thematic chapters of the economic update. And we are doing this through the labor markets, what the human side of this macroeconomic turmoil through what happens in labor markets. Our analytical framework is especially looking at the trade-off between employment and wages in times of turmoil. When there are negative shocks, the policy challenge is this trade-off between more unemployment and lower real wages. And this is what we call the balancing act. When there's a shock, and labor demand falls, either unemployment will go up or real wages will go down. But there is extensive academic evidence on how during downturns, wages tend to be rigid or sticky. And if that is the case, then the main channel of adjustment will be employment. However, when the shock occurs, and comes accompanied with high rates of inflation, real wages will fall, even if nominal wages remain constant, and that will help buffer the shock in employment. And so this is what we want to understand in this report: what happens in MENA during shocks? How do labor markets in MENA tend to adjust when there are shocks, when there are downturns in economic activity? And we are doing this in two ways. First, we look at cross-country evidence, and that is what I'm going to present in the next slide. And then we are looking at specific shocks in MENA's economic history, specific episodes, to try to understand how labor markets adjust. Next slide, please. On the cross-country evidence, what we find is that the MENA region tends to exhibit a higher sensitivity of unemployment to downturns, to fluctuations in real GDP, compared to the average emerging market and developing economy. In this figure, we are showing this estimate of the average responsiveness, and this comes from an analysis of more than 30 years of comparable cross-country labor market indicators. The data comes from ILO, and we are happy to talk more or share our exercise with anyone who is interested. And what we see is that when things are going well, when there are expansions in real GDP, unemployment tends to fall, and that is the blue bars in this figure. And you see there that the responsiveness in MENA is comparable to other emerging market and developing economies. However, during downturns, when real GDP contracts and things are not going well, unemployment tends to increase much more in the MENA region, almost twice as much compared to the benchmark, compared to other emerging markets and developing economies. And so what this means is that this same negative shock tends to increase unemployment much more in the MENA region. When we look at other indicators, for example, rates of labor force participation, rates of self-employment, even rates of public sector employment, the responses between MENA and the benchmark are comparable, and we invite the audience to look at the report, and we have there the results and more details on how we are computing these elasticities. But MENA is very different in this critical dimension in unemployment. And so what we estimate is that the shocks from 2020 through 2022 cumulatively have led to an additional 5 million unemployed workers in the region. These are potentially 5 million workers who were scarred in their career prospects as a result of these shocks, which we have already discussed. And so now Nelly is going to talk about other episodes where the results are actually qualitatively similar. Thank you, Nelly.
Thank you, Jessica. So now we're going to turn to the analysis of specific shocks that affected the MENA region as well as emerging markets and developing economies. We conducted a number of event studies in order to provide a deep dive into some specific episodes that affected the MENA region. We find, for example, that following the COVID-19 shock, unemployment was the main margin of adjustment in emerging market and developing economies, while on the other hand, we find that nominal monthly earnings were unchanged. In this slide, we are reporting the results from a fixed effect regressions on various labor market outcomes. We're looking on the left-hand side on unemployment, and on the right-hand side, we're looking at monthly nominal earnings. We're using data that's provided by the International Labour Organization, and we are reporting the coefficient estimates with respect to the baseline year, which is in this case the year 2019, preceding the onset of the COVID-19 shock. As you can see, we find a sizable increase in unemployment in emerging market and developing economies in the immediate aftermath of the COVID-19 shock. We estimate approximately an increase in unemployment by 1.5 percentage points in 2020. And we also find that unemployment remained relatively higher with respect to the year 2019, even in the year 2021. On the other hand, echoing what Jessica was saying earlier regarding the literature highlighting nominal downward wage rigidities, we also find that nominal monthly earnings remained rigid in the aftermath of the COVID-19 shock in our sample of emerging market and developing economies. In the MENA region, we also find that unemployment took center stage as the primary margin of adjustment after the COVID-19 shock. In this slide, we are reporting the percentage point change that is attributed to the COVID-19 shock between 2020 Q2 and 2021 Q4. In order to do so, we rely on quarterly data that's usually available from the year 2012 onward from various countries in the region. We include, for example, in our sample, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, as well as 2 GCC countries, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. We use various sources provided by the International Labour Organization, LFS microdata, as well as data from various national statistical offices. And again, the challenge here is to try to isolate the impact of COVID-19 on unemployment rates. And to do so, we rely on quarterly data from 2012 in order to predict what would have been unemployment rate in the absence of the COVID-19 shock. And then to come up with an estimate of the impact of the pandemic, we subtract the predicted unemployment rate from the observed unemployment rate. As you can see, we estimate an increase in unemployment rate by about 2.5 percentage points in 2020 Q2, which is the quarter that followed the beginning of the pandemic. And then we also estimate large increases in the immediate aftermath of the shock, and then these increases in unemployment slowly decline towards the end of 2021. And these are the results aggregated for both women and men, but in the reports, you will also find more information by gender, by age groups, as well as by differentiating between migrants and the national population. We highlight also in the report that when shocks trigger inflation, the labor market may be adjusting differently through lower real wages, and that's the case, for example, following large currency devaluations. In this slide, we are reporting the results from a staggered difference in differences approach in emerging markets and developing economies, and we're looking at the adjustment in real monthly earnings following large currency devaluations. We use an ad hoc definition that reflects the experience of MENA countries. Specifically, the threshold that we use in order to determine whether a country experienced a large currency devaluation versus not is a 30% threshold, which reflects the smallest of the 3 largest devaluations experienced in Egypt in the past 20 years. The coefficient estimates are reported in blue after the currency devaluations, whereas before the currency devaluation, the estimates are reported by the red square. As you can see, we find a sizable decline in real monthly earnings following large currency devaluations in emerging markets and developing economies, which again might highlight that following shocks that are associated with high inflation, labor markets may be adjusting more through changes in prices rather than changes in quantities. In the report, we also look at various margins of adjustment through quantities such as unemployment, hours worked, and then we also conclude that adjustment through prices may be more prevalent in such a context. We also provide evidence using a case study from Egypt that inflation can help buffer the unemployment adjustment following the 2016 currency devaluation. However, this comes at a different cost, which is the erosion of real incomes. In this slide, we are reporting the changes in real wages after the 2016 currency devaluation in Egypt, when the Central Bank of Egypt ended the managed float regime in November 2016. As you can see, after the currency devaluation in Egypt, real incomes fell gradually by 5% in the 3 months after the devaluation, and we find that workers may have lost up to a fifth of their real incomes 15 months after the currency devaluation episode. It's important to highlight that inflation in Egypt stood at 30% in 2017 after the currency devaluation. On the other hand, if we look at unemployment rate, we find that unemployment declined from 11% in 2016 Q4 to 9% in 2017 Q1, which again suggests that inflation may, in this case, help buffer this unemployment adjustment, but again, it comes at a different cost, which is, in this case, a decline in real incomes. In the report, we discuss what are the implications of these findings in terms of labor scoring and in terms of standards of living. As we highlighted throughout the presentation, labor scoring in this case refers to a term that's used in the literature to highlight the long-term negative consequences that are linked to these job losses. In this slide, we use data from the Egypt Labor Market Panel survey in 2018, which was conducted obviously by the ERF. And we use the retrospective section of the survey in order to track individual job trajectories from the first job that the individual had at the beginning of their career and up to the job that the individual holds at the time of the survey. Through this retrospective section of the survey, we're also able of tracking individual job trajectories as well as the reasons the individuals got separated from their jobs. And that allows us to categorize individuals as either involuntarily displaced from their jobs or those that were never subject to this type of displacement. In our definition of involuntary displacement, we define individuals as forcibly displaced if they were either subject to job termination, project suspension, or firm shutdown. And one interesting finding that emerges is that we find that displaced workers generally have worse labor market prospects at the time of the survey compared to individuals that were never subject to this type of displacement. For example, in this slide, we are reporting informality rates for non-displaced and displaced men, and we find that informality is higher among those individuals that witness this type of displacement. At the same time, we find that earnings, real hourly wages, are lower among displaced women versus those that were not displaced. Importantly, we highlight in this report that the consequences could be felt even years after these job losses. We document that these effects could persist even 10 years after these job separations. Once again, we highlight that even after accounting for various observable characteristics and year of job separation fixed effects, displaced men are 9 percentage points more likely to be informally employed compared to those that were never displaced. And then we also find that displaced women experience a wage penalty of 20%. As we highlighted through this presentation, the balancing act that this report looks at is this trade-off between job losses and lower real earnings. Job losses can carry important and persistent scarring in terms of job trajectories, and these can be reflected either through lower real incomes or through worse labor market prospect as reflected by higher informality or higher unemployment. Lower real wages, on the other hand, raise different challenges because they carry negative implications in terms of standards of living and in terms of income inequality. In the report, we also highlight various policy options. We discuss the policy toolkit and highlight that the policy toolkit offers different instruments. However, not all of these instruments have the same proven record of effectiveness. Labor markets can adjust either through changes in quantities, and that could result in job losses or informality, or through changes in prices, which in this case could be associated with a reduction in real wages. Active labor market policies is one of the policy instruments that could be utilized in order to remedy these labor market effects. However, as we highlight in the report, the academic literature, but also various reports published by the World Bank and by other international organizations, document that active labor market policies have a mixed track record. And by that, it means that the type of the program, the institutional design, as well as the implementation of these programs carry important implications in terms of the effectiveness of these various interventions. At the same time, formalization interventions, which have been also studied in various meta-analyses, also have been found to lead to a mixed results. For example, the evidence that these formalization interventions are actually effective at inducing higher formalization is very thin and requires further piloting. On the other hand, cash transfer programs and social safety nets have been documented to generate documented results on a broad range of outcomes, including, for example, consumption, well-being, and assets. And in fact, there is a recent paper that was published in Econometrica that shows that large cash transfer programs are not only beneficial among treated households, but they can also have positive spillover effects among non-treated households. We also highlight that it's very important to maintain the flexibility of real wages, because by indexing wages to inflation, for example, that would shut down the price adjustment channel. And in this case, the labor market would be only allowed to adjust exclusively through changes in quantities. And as we highlighted in this presentation, this can carry a long-term scarring effect and could even worsen existing structural issues in MENA labor market through higher long-term informality or higher long-term unemployment. So to conclude, how do economies face this delicate trade-off between higher unemployment and lower real earnings? This is the balancing act that the report highlights, and we highlight that neither outcome is desirable. However, the policy recommendations of this report are quite clear. We highlight that real wage flexibility combined with well-targeted cash transfers are the best approach in order to protect the most vulnerable segments of the population. It's important to be mindful of those experiencing job losses in the immediate aftermath of these shocks, because they could be subject to long-term scarring effects and could be permanently affected by these shocks. At the same time, it's also very important to prioritize well-targeted cash transfers that are directly targeting the most vulnerable segments of the population. Finally, we highlight that it's important to make sure that effective policies are well designed and not to index wages, for example, to inflation, because once again, this could worsen enduring structural challenges in the MENA region. So what can we do? We highlight in the report that it's very important to start by reforming social protection systems in the MENA region and to redirect fiscal resources from inefficient consumption subsidies to more efficient measures that have a good track record in the academic literature, but also in various reports such as well-targeted cash transfers. And that's precisely in order to safeguard the livelihoods of the people in MENA. We will stop here. We thank you very much for your attention. We look forward to Ragi's and Iren's discussion, and we look forward to the comments from the audience. Thank you on behalf of the team.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nelly. Thank you, Jessica. We go directly to our first lead commentator, Professor Raghi Assad, Professor of Planning and Public Affairs, University of Minnesota, and a long-standing research fellow of ERF. Raghi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Nelly and Jessica, for a very interesting report and presentation. I very much enjoyed reading it. So as the report points out, MENA economies have faced a series of crises from 2020 to 2023, with several countries such as Lebanon, Egypt, and Iran starting the period already very vulnerable due to pre-pandemic shocks that occurred, and countries like Jordan and Tunisia still recovering from the aftermath of the Arab Spring. So these crises came on top of a series. Now, one thing that the report seems to lump all these crises together, where I think the pandemic and the labor supply shock that occurred during the pandemic is quite different from the foreign exchange crises and the crisis of financing and high interest rates and high energy costs that or lack of foreign exchange that occurred. So I would have liked to see a little bit more differentiation with the types of crises. But in any case, faced with these shocks, which could no longer be financed by drawing down reserves or short-term international financing, economies with unsustainable external balances had to adjust by substantially reducing demand. And the main message of the report is about the nature of these adjustments and the consequences of these adjustments for the labor market. So faced with reduced demand, labor markets adjust, as the report says, either on the quantity margin or which means lower employment, or on the price margin, which means lower real wages. Now, I want to suggest that lower employment does not only translate as higher unemployment. And I'm going to make that point later. There are types of underemployment that occurs especially when the adjustment is on the intensive margin, that are not measured by the unemployment rate, and that are measured by something like the time-related underemployment, basically lower employment rates among people who are observed as employed but have significantly lower hours involuntarily. I'll get back to that point. But so the lower real wages are usually achieved through inflation, eroding real wages, and the inflation itself is the result of currency devaluations and depreciations, which what was the report highlighting. So the main mechanism, so the countries that essentially have a currency regime that is not flexible, for instance, Jordan, which doesn't allow for currency devaluations at all of the adjustment has to occur on the quantity side of the labor market rather than the price side. Whereas a country like Egypt, which has adopted kind of a more flexible exchange rate, although this is debatable how flexible it is, have seen the adjustment occur much more on the price side with eroding real wages. Now, so as the report suggests, when employment declines, it can occur at the extensive margin, and this is basically firms not hiring or even shedding some workers, regular workers, or at the intensive margin, where casual workers in particular finding less work and working fewer days. The former, the firms not hiring or shedding workers, is captured by the open unemployment rate. The latter is usually captured by the time-related underemployment rate, which is a very important statistic, which we rarely see in World Bank reports, and we should see more, that has proven to be extremely sensitive to crisis. And we have shown in other reports that particular indicator of labor underutilization is the best indicator of what happens to workers during crisis. And it focuses, and it's defined basically as the proportion of employed workers who are working less than full-time, usually operationalized as 35 hours per week, involuntarily, not out of choice. And that indicator tends to highlight the labor market problems of poor, informal, casual workers who are the most vulnerable to crisis, whereas the unemployment rate does not do that. It only highlights the plight of educated workers, mostly in the region, and those who are essentially having extended waiting times before they get their first formal jobs. Now, the report argues that those who lose permanent jobs are strongly scarred in the long run, and this needs to be avoided to avoid that displacement. However, I haven't seen any evidence in the report to suggest that the increase in unemployment in MENA is made up of regular workers formal workers who were displaced from regular jobs. In fact, my hunch is that much of the increase in unemployment is among new entrants who are not finding employment and increasing their waiting and queuing rates. There may be also some increase in unemployment that comes from the informal workers being unemployed for more than that 1 week and therefore being captured in the unemployment statistics. But none of these groups are going to face the skill atrophy or this scarring of displaced workers. So unless you convince me that there is a large number of displaced workers from formal, regular jobs among the unemployed, I'm not going to really buy the argument about the scarring, which comes from Western contexts in which displaced workers have been studied and followed. So my experience, I don't see a lot of these displaced workers among the unemployed in MENA. Now, there is, however, another argument in favor of real wage flexibility as opposed to quantitative employment adjustment, which is not mentioned by the report. And that argument is that real wage flexibility tends to spread the pain across a very large group of people, where a lot of people experience the real wage declines, and therefore the pain is a little shallower compared to job losses among casual workers in particular, where the pain is very concentrated among a specific group of vulnerable workers who are poor and informal and tend to be casual. So I think there is an argument for why you would want real wage flexibility as opposed to quantity adjustment that is not the same as the scarring argument that the report advances. Now, the recommendations of the report that they should not do quantity adjustment but should do real wage adjustments, I think should actually be well accepted in the region if it's interpreted primarily as protecting formal sector workers from job losses, because that is in fact what the governments do pretty well already. There is a great deal of job protection for incumbent formal workers. What is ignored is what happens to the casual workers who are unable to find employment during crises, and there is very little protection for them. So I would think that the focus should be to focus on the employment vulnerability of casual and informal workers when quantity adjustment occurs, and creating safety nets appropriate for these workers. I'm a little bit skeptical of the report's suggestion that social safety nets should be the primary way of dealing with the real wage flexibility and the real wage declines during crisis, and primarily because it's going to be very hard to sell to governments that they need to increase spending on these cash transfers and safety nets at a time of fiscal distress when there's a tremendous amount of pressure on them to reduce expenditure. So they have to actually slash expenditure elsewhere in the budget much more dramatically in order to increase expenditures on these safety nets. And maybe the World Bank can convince them to do that. But I think that generally these safety nets are going to be more open to them in times of less fiscal distress. And I'm going to stop here.
Thanks ever so much, Raghi. And we go straight to Irene Selwanis. Irene is Associate Professor, Faculty of Economics and Political Science, Cairo University, and an ERF Research Fellow. Irene?
Thank you very much, Shireen, for the introduction, and I'd like to thank Jessica, Nelly, and the authors for a very comprehensive and rich report. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel, and I'll go straight to my comments. Just a second. Yeah. Now, the key takeaways is about the question whether the economic adjustment to shocks in MENA is actually through employment quantities or wages and or prices, and how does this vary with the inflation context. And so these are basically the main findings that I found very interesting in the report, which is in time of a contraction like COVID-19, jobs and quantities are key adjustment mechanism, and they highlighted that it's kind of a more punctuated response in the MENA region relative to the other emerging and developing economies. So a negative shock of real GDP by 1% is associated with an increase of 0.27 percentage point in unemployment, and I find this massive. Now, for me, it was a little maybe surprising, because I thought, because of the relatively high prevalence of informality in the region, this response should be cushioned. But then they later show that this is not despite the relatively high prevalence of informality. They argue that this is actually because the high prevalence of informality, that informal workers were the first to be laid off, and hence unemployment peaked. So I'm gonna get back to this, because I have some also reflections on that. Now, in other times of contractions, like negative terms of trade or volatile terms of trade, with no inflationary pressure, quantities and hours were the key adjustment, and they took a case study as what happened in Iran. Now, inflationary shocks like a currency devaluation, and here the real wages drop, and this is because of the rigidity in the nominal wages in the short term. So nominal wages does not vary, is sticky, and this shelters jobs. However, and they took a case study in Egypt. And then they also found something that I really wanted to stop at, and I wish the report to delve deeper into, which is that they found that stickier wages in MENA than the other emerging and developing economies. And they found that real wages are counter-cyclical in contractions and expansions, whereas it's only counter-cyclical in contractions in other emerging and developing countries. And I really wish the report to give more insight about this result and why it's stickier in MENA than the other countries. Now, there are in specific shocks like the COVID, there were differentiated impacts on vulnerable groups in the labor market, like the youth, for example. So the youth unemployment adjustment was much more sharper than overall unemployment, suggesting what Professor Assad also said, that the unemployment is basically the problem of new entrants and youth. So it actually backs up, the finding of the report backs up the idea that the unemployment is something that mostly capture the new entrants, educated unemployment. Now, for some countries, women's adjustment to the crisis was through exiting the labor market, and this is another very serious finding of the report, and I think more policy responses need to be advanced in order to stop that. Now, for me, another set of key takeaways was that all this report was made possible because of the high frequency data, right? And the lack of publicly accessible and high frequency microdata has actually made some of the analysis not possible. So we don't much know about what happens to hours of work during the economic crisis. And we need to know this, because maybe all the adjustments happen through the hours of work rather than laying off, or what also Professor Assad has referred to as the time-related underemployment. So the report only did the available data was a high-frequency labor force data for the West Bank and Gaza, and this available data made the analysis possible. Otherwise, we don't know. So I think we need, one of the policy responses as well is to fund for data in addition to all the other fiscal policy and monetary policy and social policies, but also data is very important cornerstone to understand the broader to understand first the adjustments, but also the broader implications of these adjustments. Now, we don't know also what happened to hourly wages. So the available data made it possible for a selection of countries like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the West Bank and Gaza in the report, but we don't know about the rest as well. And we would like to know more, but also more longitudinal data that will allow to study the transition patterns in and out formality, but also the job finding rates, which was also mentioned in the report, and I wish to understand, to kind of delve deeper in it, but also the lack of data is a major challenge for us to understand better. Now, we also want to understand the long-term impacts, this scarring phenomenon. How is it validated, etc. But we also would like to know if we have in the region something like intergenerational labor market scaring. Will parents' labor market outcomes, like bad quality jobs or something, how would it translate into education scarring for children and possibly labor market? So, I mean, the data matters for the MENA region, and this is a very important topic, and we need to kind of emphasize that more in our reports, that we need fund for data, and we need to make these data publicly accessible as well. Now, I have a set of broader questions and possibly area for future research. Now, I'd like to recognize that the nature of COVID-19 crisis is quite different than the nature of other negative shocks. So perhaps more unemployment due to closures and due to the kind of precautionary measures that is specifically related to COVID-19, but that does not replicate in other negative shocks or contractions. I also want to think about that the adjustment, I believe the adjustment in the MENA region is more through poor quality employment, and that I didn't find well emphasized in the report. I think it's through poor quality employment rather than job loss unemployment. It's through irregular work, the surge in irregular work, surge in precarious work, rather than job loss and unemployment. And I would like to learn how MENA is faring compared to the other emerging and developing countries. I also think there is a good argument for the real wages flexibility for sure, but I'm wondering whether the erosion of real wages can also carry long-term negative effects on labor market outcome and quality of employment. So the recent evidence from Egypt and Jordan that lower wage earners won't afford remaining in social security and won't afford paying taxes, social insurance contributions, etc., etc. So basically, flexibility of real wages is good, but on the long run, it might, if it continues, it might also replicate other, like poor quality employment that we do not want to see. Now, I would also like to understand that, to reflect that sometimes during crisis, the report argue that the main driver of real wage cuts is the nominal wage rigidities. However, the literature suggests that the currency crisis in specific may trigger a large and persistent loss in labor productivity or labor bargaining power, lower bargaining power of labor. So both of which can lead to real wage cuts, but we don't really know if what we observe in the MENA region in the short term, yes, it's due to nominal wage rigidity, but will it continue in the long run? And if it's continued on the long run, will it have a lot, is it because a loss of labor productivity or a bargaining power? That we need to understand better. I have a set of, I also thought about some additional policy options to address these labor market adjustment in crisis, beyond a little bit beyond the safety nets. But then what about policies to support businesses? Like we know from the evidence that sometimes it worked, the wage subsidies, for example, in Mexico, while it had no effect on retaining workers, it had an effect on, it acted as a more liquidity for hiring back workers. But also other evidence suggests that it works for a selection of countries. We would like to know, more needs to be done in order to understand what works for the MENA region. Is it access to credit? Is it tax support? Is it payment deferring of payments, or what? But also, I would also like to think about the social safety nets are important, right? But then we need to have a kind of a, we need to work towards productive labor markets and more resilient labor markets, like really boosting job finding rates, and that won't happen with just social safety nets, but it needs some kind of targeted investment in productive sectors. And a recent report of ILO forecast that targeted investment in digital technology, the green economy, and the care economy would generate some new jobs especially for youth. They forecast 830,000 jobs for youth. But then I think also we need to think about productive ways to shelter people. Like we need to think about unemployment insurance, its role, how to activate it, and even use it as an incentives for people to join social insurance schemes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irene. We've got 5 minutes to close, so we can go back to Nelly and Jessica for reactions and feedback.
Thank you very much, Raghi and Irene. This is super helpful, and you gave us a very, very important set of comments. I'm going to respond to a few, and then I'm going to leave the floor back to Jessica so she can also have the time to respond. So I think all the points you're making are very well taken. I think some of the points that you're making were not possible to address just because, as you mentioned, of data availability issues. So it would have been really nice to dig deeper into what's happening to hourly wages, what's happening to the various types of employment, as Raghi was saying, what's happening also in terms of underemployment. I think it's an issue that you both raised. And I think this is really a matter of data availability. We're constrained by the type of data that we were using and also by the very specific episodes that we were studying. So that added also another layer of complexity to the issue. So on the issue that Raghi was raising regarding the differentiation of the various shocks. So we were trying, as Jessica pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, to provide the evidence both from a broader standpoint, but what's happening by looking at what's happening during periods of expansions and downturns, and also trying to investigate what's happening during after specific shocks. And that's why we try to differentiate between COVID versus, for example, currency devaluations or negative terms of trade shocks. I think the point you made, Raghi, regarding the labor underutilization is very well taken. And I think it's, again, possible to do whenever we have yearly data, but once again, the main focus of this report was to try to track these changes using quarterly data. So I think only when data allows it, this is something that we could technically consider for future research, and I think it's very helpful. Now, I think you also gave us a very good point regarding the reason why it's important to advocate for real wage flexibility, and I think we fully concur. And then one point that I wanted to highlight, you were mentioning that the evidence is predominantly from developed countries on labor scoring, but there is now a very small but growing literature on labor scoring in developing countries. And for example, we're citing a paper by Daniel Lederman and a co-author that looks at Mexico. And in fact, they do find evidence in Mexico that even after plant closings, there is evidence of earnings scoring that persisted for about 10 years after the closure of certain plants. You also made a very good point that we as a team reflected on, which is about the how to finance really cash transfers during periods of economic downturns. And this is something that I think lies a bit beyond the scope of the report. However, we mentioned at the beginning of the report that this calls for another type of adjustment, which is basically to try to raise ex ante savings in the form of emergency funds in order to be able to utilize them during periods of economic downturns. But for sure, this is a very important point, and actually it wouldn't be possible to finance these cash transfers without having these emergency funds. Irene, I think you raised very good points about also the probability of women dropping out of the labor force after various shocks, and this is something that we looked at specifically in the context of West Bank and Gaza after the COVID-19 shock, and we did find evidence of increased probability of being out of the labor force. We also fully agree about the point on data availability and the importance of quarterly data in order to track momentous changes in the aftermath of these various shocks. And this is a tradition that we have taken on since the beginning of these MEUs to try to document missing data and try to push for the data agenda. You also highlighted poor quality of employment in the aftermath of the COVID-19 shock, or in general, that in the MENA region, it could be one of the main ways the labor markets adjust. And this is something that we briefly touch upon in the report when we're talking about fluctuations in flows into and out of informality. And we do find evidence that informality inflows tend to increase, and that's because these are the individuals that tend to lose their jobs, but also as the labor market starts to recover, individuals may be ending up into the informal sector as they start to gain their jobs. One final point that I would like to make regarding the policy options and the discussions on wage subsidies. We do highlight in the report that job retention schemes, which were employed in OECD countries in order to address the challenges of the labor market after the COVID-19 shock, they were associated with good labor market outcomes in the sense that they kind of buffered the unemployment adjustment in a number of OECD countries. However, we also highlight that in labor markets such as the United States, where they predominantly used cash transfers, this resulted in even healthier and tighter labor markets. So with the benefit of hindsight, we think that cash transfers may be superior to these other job retention schemes. Over to you, Jessica. Thank you again, Raghi and Irene.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I join you, Nelly, in thanking our discussants, thanking Shireen for organizing this event, letting us share the findings of this report. Perhaps just a couple of comments on the effects of children, the effects on children. Irene, actually, this report follows goes really well with the previous economic update, where we looked at the effect of inflation on children stunting. So very relevant. It's another look at the human side of macroeconomic shocks now through the effect on children. And then on your question on the counter-cyclicality of wages, we are limited, as you pointed out, by data availability, but the team is working on a flagship together. It's the same team, Nelly and I, together with more colleagues, and we want to dig deeper into this question. What is driving this countercyclicality? So where data is available, we want to try to understand, and we will reach out when we have some preliminary results to Raghi as well, to try to learn and get your reactions. And perhaps, Shireen, you can share Irene's slides with us so that we can take a slower look. I took notes, Raghi, on all your comments. Thank you very much. Very helpful. And I think that's it on behalf of us. Thanks.
Thanks ever so much. Thanks to Nelly, Jessica, Raghi, Irene. Thank you for
power. Was there maybe a problem with the power?
Namis is still there. Namis, can you say something?
Yes, Dr. Raghi, I guess it's a power issue at Shireen's place.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I guess she was closing. So please
All
go
right.
ahead.
So I think she was closing and thanking everybody. And so thank you, Pia. And we'll.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you all
everybody.
very much.
I've got a power cut, but I was just saying thank you. And all the information is online, and really grateful for all the input. Much appreciated.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
Shireen, for organizing the event. And thank you again, Raghi and Iran.
Thank you.